Why do so many medieval fantasy worlds avoid canons? I think there are a lot of reasons. Among them, one, most Middle Ages inspired stories draw most heavily from earlier in the period. Arthurian legend hangs heavy over fantasy, and Arthur didn't have canons. Two, let's be honest, a lot of medieval inspo is pretty loose. You don't see the Crusades come up that often either. Three, aesthetically, most big, destructive damage in fantasy tends to be done by magic. The wizards are the canons, so canons are oddly redundant. That's putting it pithily. Canons were available for maybe a third of the medieval period, and many authors don't avoid them. Because these aren't medieval settings, they're fantasy. And in a world with magic, it's understandable that gunpowder might not have been invented. I can see it now. Oh, your little flash powder is so cute. Fireball. What happens to your gunpowder magazine when an enemy mage drops a spark in it from across the battlefield? I just don't like gunpowder. There's a sort of modernity threshold that I don't like passing for my medieval fantasy, and cannons and guns are on the wrong side of it. I know it's anachronistic, if that's the right word, to feel that way about it. People were using cannons pretty early in the Middle Ages, maybe as early as the 1200s. But anytime I think about warfare with cannons, I immediately start picturing pirates or redcoats. Because most fantasy has its roots in Lord of the Rings and folklore, not in actual history. Edit. Autocorrect. Warhammer Fantasy has plenty of guns and cannons, it's great. In general fiction cares more about the popular tropes of a vaguely defined medieval setting than historical accuracy. It is the Tiffany problem. Just because something genuinely is really old doesn't mean it feels like it to readers. While technically correct, the introduction of readily available black powder weaponry like muskets and cannons generally denotes its own subgenre distinct from medieval fantasy, often called, unsurprisingly, black powder fantasy. In terms of aesthetics, anything more complex than a rare hand cannon in a fantasy novel is generally a conscious decision to push a setting more towards a Renaissance or Napoleonic era. Same reason you don't see many in things like D&D. People just don't really know how to handle them or don't really like gunpowder in their world. Gunpowder, saltpeter, if you have magic in this setting you might not ever need or discover those things. Most fantasy worlds take various inspiration from the Xth to XVIIth century, with some elements from the XVth for flavor. And cannons are generally considered to be too much of a leap in design compared to full-plate armor. Also, the role of cannons in XIVth century France and England was a bit peculiar and hard to show under an epic lens. And then, they brought the new machines of war, and those tubes spat smoke and thunder, and a small hole could be seen in the ceiling of one of the houses. Not including a thing is not the same as avoiding a thing. That thing simply isn't a part of the story the author wants to tell. Death tubes exist in the First Law universe. While not exactly cannons, the Malaysian Empire employs sappers in its armies. From those deep-throated engines belched, whose roar emboweled with outrageous noise the air, and all her entrails tore, disgorging foul their devilish glut, chained thunderbolts and hail of iron globes. Paradise Lost, John Milton. Milton was writing from the Renaissance, when cannon were, militarily speaking, canon. But I always thought his putting them into the Revolt of the Angels to be absurdly anachronistic. It just didn't fit. Most fantasy isn't even medieval. You cannot call, say, your classic D&D style Baldur's Gate setting, or whatever, as medieval. Of the most popular fantasy authors, G.R.R.M., Jordan, Pratchett, and Sanderson are all writing different takes on early modern, or just straight modern, Mistborn, later Discworld. And God knows how to classify Tolkien, like mostly outdoors or something. Runs the whole gamut. They just mostly don't have guns because the authors don't want guns. Most people have a picture of medieval times that's pretty inaccurate in many ways. And there's been a sort of fantasy standard that was set early by people like Tolkien, who really didn't want to have stuff like cannons. A lot of fantasy isn't even really medieval but represents other eras of history, often later, just with gunpowder tech cut from it. Which for one means that there's no real reason to follow one era people mistakenly apply to the setting, but also that people are often hesitant. I always saw cannons as the direct counter to the range of a mage. In a story where mages cannot teleport and function as battlefield artillery in battle scenes, a cannon almost always should reasonably match or exceed the range of a mage. At least, that is my internal headcanon. In a world where mages exist, I would expect guns, the evolution of the cannon, to stall or slow down. Especially when arrows can be enchanted and were, for much of real history, more accurate and quick than. Read Instrumentalities of the Night by Glenn Cook. The first 3 books are excellent. I think it's mainly because some people think it takes away from the fantasy and brings things more towards boring reality. What's the fun in an archmage who just gets pasted across the scenery by a cannonball? Personally, I disagree, but I think that's a lot of it. You do see it occasionally, and I think it adds a really fun dynamic. I remember one of my favorite computer games as a kid was Arcanum, which was an RPG based on the premise of a traditional fantasy world that was having an industry. Cannons on dragons. Most so-called medieval fantasy worlds are more like Renaissance minus the guns. Welp, you can accuse Milton of this. In Paradise Lost, the angelic hosts then up to fight with cannons galore. I'm gonna be real with you. Most book writers don't do any research. They just write the books they want to write and don't realize just how uneducated most of us are on most topics. So real shit like cannons falls through.